Well, all right, we are back for another session of compelling evidence for why we believe what we believe. And before we get into that, got a couple of administrative items. Number one, we originally did not think we were going to be able to record these sessions for later viewing. But due to the great work of Ron and Pastor Matt and Sade, those sessions are now available on the Confident Faith webpage of the PCC website, as will this one be and the ones going forward. Secondly, if you are online with us tonight, welcome. And if you haven't gone to the Confident Faith webpage to download tonight's handout, session 2 handout.pdf, you want to do that, you'll also be able to get the slides there as well. Well, tonight's session is really an extension of what we talked about last week in terms of the existence of God, that God is the cause of the universe. He is the designer of the universe for life to exist. He is the moral lawgiver, and he is the one who has initiated personal relationships with so many here on this earth. Tonight we're talking about how did we get here? And so this is all about evolution, creation, where do they overlap, where do they diverge? I was not raised in a Christian home. I received a degree in computer science from UCI right up the road, and immediately thereafter entered into a job as a software engineer. I was kind of cruising through life when in my mid-20s, I just got this very strong notion that this whole life, this whole existence is just kind of weird. I mean, we're on this planet rotating at 1,000 miles per hour around its axis. We're going around the sun at 67,000 miles an hour, and we're hurling through space in the solar system and through the Milky Way in over 400,000 miles an hour. Yet, I still feel like I'm standing still. I'm not getting any motion sickness or anything. So this is kind of the weirdness of my thoughts in my mid-20s, and it was really kind of an existential crisis. Why am I here? How did I get here? And so going down the investigation of that path led to me coming to a belief in God and in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. One of the things that hit me in my job as a software engineer is that we really, with computers and programming them, we were trying to emulate the human brain. And it became very clear very early that computers are really kind of pathetic at modeling what our brains can do with all of the emotion, the reasoning, that we can change context real quickly. Computers are very fast at doing things, but they're very repetitive in the things that they do. If you try to change a data format or a requirement or an interface, you end up getting these error messages on the screen, you get spinning hourglasses and all that kind of stuff that's just a nightmare, right? And I know we are in the age of artificial intelligence, AI, and I've done work in AI and I've studied it in school. And I can tell you, we're still far away from computers being able to think for themselves. And this whole idea, why am I telling you this? Because it's a topic for tonight. Our bodies are incredible processors of information, not just in the brain, but in the basic building blocks that make up our bodies, in the very cells, the trillions of cells that we learned about last week. This DNA is an information source that is incredibly complicated. And we're going to go more into that here as we look at the question of how did we get here? So let me pray to get us started tonight. Father, we come before you hungry. We have appetites to learn. We're so grateful that you've given us minds that are curious and that are capable. And we come to learn from you. You are the master architect, the master engineer, the master artist. And as we sit at your feet, we know that we will grow tremendously in our knowledge and understanding of who you are and the wonders of your mighty works. May you bless us in our growth this evening, that we would bring glory to your name. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. All right, well, just like last week, I'd like to kind of set the stage with a short video clip from Sean McDowell.
Can a Christian believe in evolution? Although this might surprise some of you, I think the answer is obviously yes. For one, I have many friends who are Christians who believe in evolution. I have no reason to question their sincerity or their relationship with God. Second, as long as you believe God is the creator then the mechanism by which God created is secondary in terms of our salvation. So I find no reason to think that a Christian can't believe in evolution. But the more interesting question is, depending on what we mean by evolution, how do you consistently wed an evolutionary worldview with Christianity? This is where certain philosophical and theological questions come to the surface. So if we mean by evolution a blind, material, undesigned, undirected process, then it's hard to see how God could use a purposeless material process. Because you'd be saying God directed an undirected process. God designed an undesigned process. So if we mean by evolution the materialistic Darwinian blind processes, then I'm not sure how you wed those two consistently philosophically. And also if you mean that definition of evolution, then it raises some tough theological questions. Is there really a historical Adam? Was there a historical fall? And what do we mean by being made in the image of God? So look, I have no problem with somebody being a Christian in principle and believing in evolution. But it's where the devil's in the detail in the philosophical and theological questions that are important, how we consistently wed a blind material process with an intelligent process. That's where the questions and the problems really emerge.
Okay, so interesting, right? Sean asked the question, can a Christian believe in evolution? And as he said, the devil is in the details. The basic definition of evolution is change over time. And I think most of us would agree that we do see change over time in biological systems. But when you start talking about a random, undirected process being the source for life and the development of life, that's where we have some serious questions. Now, Charles Darwin put out his theory of evolution back in 1859 in the book on the origin of the species, 160 years ago. And since then, scientists on the evolutionary side of things have done a lot of work, and they've changed their theories based on discoveries and things like that, to the point where now we have the neo-Darwinism. So that's kind of what we're going to cover tonight, is this neo-Darwinism. But at the base of that is still the basic ideas from Charles Darwin's book. And it's good for us to take a look at that just for a quick reminder of what that's all about. What you have on the slide is a page out of On the Origin of the Species from 1859 by Charles Darwin. It is Darwin's Tree of Life. Basically, the progression of complexity of life forms from a single-celled organism, which you don't see because it's off the bottom of the page there, but it reproduced into successive generations, and in those generations there were different kinds of organisms, and some of them were fit for their environment and continued to reproduce into further life forms, and some of them weren't fit for their environment, and they basically were discarded and went extinct. So here's two basic premises that we'll be looking at tonight from Darwinian evolution. Number one, that all life is descended from a common ancestor, single-celled organism. Secondly, the mechanism through which organisms get more and more complex in this tree is natural selection through genetic mutation, which is what I described. This is, so we ask the question, is this a possible mechanism for life to come into existence and life to develop? On this tree, what you would see if you could zoom in on it is movement from fishes to amphibians, amphibians to reptiles, reptiles to birds, reptiles to mammals, apes to men, so on and so forth. You kind of know the progression. So tonight, we're going to look at this and ask that question, what's the evidence for any truth in this, in 4 different ways. First, we're going to look at evolution's origin of life, called abiogenesis. What they say is that single-celled organism, life, came from non-organic chemicals in the sea, in the soil, in the atmosphere, so on and so forth. What's the evidence we have for that? Secondly, microevolution versus macroevolution. So kind of dividing this idea of Darwinian evolution into two subtopics. They have different scopes in terms of the taxonomy of living things, and they have different confidence levels for whether they're true or not. And I won't steal too much of Clint's thunder, but one of these has evidence that we say, hey, that looks like that's probably true. The other one, not so much. So more to come on that. Number 3, the fossil record. That tree of life that we saw. If that is true, what has the archaeology told us about transitional forms? And what that means is between those fishes and amphibians, those amphibians and reptiles, reptiles and birds, do we see anything in the fossil record that looks like it's part reptile and part mammal, part reptile and part bird? Do we see anything like that? So we're going to go over that tonight. And then 4th is really the creationist approaches. And there are a couple that Brent's going to dive into in some detail, but we're going to focus on the one called intelligent design. So let's dive right in to our first subtopic tonight, evolution's origin of life, abiogenesis. So this is life just coming into existence from non-living matter, from chemicals in the soil, in the sea, in the atmosphere. What evidence do we have for that? Well, I talked a little bit about that whole thing with the computers and the brain and the cells and all of that. What we know is that very complex information is required to build even the most basic organisms. I learned yesterday that the amoeba, the single-celled organism, has the most complicated DNA of any organism on Earth. I was blown away by that. So this DNA is the foundation for life. It's incredibly complex information. So where we're going with this is can this DNA come out of inorganic material in order for life to exist? It was said by somebody, and I'm quoting here, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. That's a pretty crazy statement. Do you know who said that? It was not Tony Marucci. Anybody know who that was? That was Bill Gates, Microsoft Corporation, who said that. And being an information technology professional, I have to take a little bit of issue with Bill's analogy. I know it's nitpicking, but DNA is not a computer program. It's not software. It's actually an information source. You can think of it kind of like a database. There's other mechanisms within the cell that take that information and build the proteins that tell a cell you're a skin cell, a nerve cell, a muscle cell, whatever it is. So I know it's nitpicking, but as an IT guy, I just had to point that out, take issue with Bill's analogy. So let's talk a little bit about DNA and how this amazing molecule that we have. We have over here on the left side in the middle, Clint and Jill Fawcett on a walk at T Street, and they're each made up of 37 trillion cells. I think we heard the number 40 trillion last week. What's a few trillion cells, right? These cells are made up of proteins, different kinds of proteins, depending on where that cell lives in the body. And those proteins are built in the cell by information from the DNA molecule. And there's some amazing statistics about DNA. Each human cell, you have 23 chromosome pairs, right? One side from mom, one side from dad, made up of DNA. In each cell, that DNA measures 6 feet. So from my foot up to my head, you've got a strand of DNA. I'm about 6 feet tall. And on those strands, actually, within the 23 chromosomes, you have 30,000 genes. The genes say what your eye color is, your hair color, your size, your shape, all of that. So just a quick overview of this amazing molecule called DNA. So the question becomes, can unguided random processes of natural selection and mutation produce something as complicated as DNA? What does the evidence tell us? We're going to watch a video now that goes deeper into that. I'm going to warn you that the host of this video is wearing this mask. It's kind of a gamer vibe. It's a little bit creepy, but this mask is a powerful message at the end of the video. So check it out.
shown that DNA is actually the software of life. It's totally interchangeable between the digital world and the biological world.
The DNA code itself is so digital, is so almost exactly like a computer tape.
Totally interchangeable.
The DNA code itself
It's the software of life.
is so digital.
Scientists have come to the amazing conclusion that our bodies contain digital code. In fact, Bill Gates, you know, the founder of Microsoft, tweeted, "DNA is more advanced than any software ever created." Think about it. A program or code is written by someone very smart. The more complex the code, the more intelligent the author has to be. So here's the question. If our DNA code is more complex than any man-made software, where did it come from? Is it possible it was authored without an author, programmed without a program? Materialists think so, through neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwinian evolution. Stephen Meyer, author of the New York Times bestseller Darwin's Doubt, explains.
According to neo-Darwinism, new genetic information arises as a result of random mutations in the arrangement of the nucleotide bases along the spine of the DNA molecule. If those random changes are beneficial, they're passed on and preserved, and if many such changes are preserved and passed on, they would accumulate over time and eventually result in a very significant change in the morphology, the form of the organism.
That's like saying if this game had glitches every time it was copied online, and gamers shared their favorite mutated versions and trashed the rest, it would eventually turn into this. Come on, really? If we know the computer glitches won't produce a new video game, how much sense does it make to believe that glitches, copying errors, and our DNA code can produce new organisms? Could random mutations in DNA really produce this? 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 What about this? 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 Or this?
Everything we know about software shows that random changes in a section of functional code or functional information is going to degrade that information long before you ever get to something fundamentally new. And that's the problem with the mutation selection mechanism as an explanation for new genetic information. Information in DNA is also essentially typographic or digital. And there are far more ways to go wrong in arranging those characters than there are ways to go right. And so as you begin to randomly change them, you inevitably fall into a non-functional abyss long before you ever generate anything fundamentally new.
So just how unlikely is it for random genetic changes to produce something new, even something as modest as a protein structure with a new function? One scientist performed experiments that enabled him to actually calculate the odds, and they aren't good. In fact, they're next to impossible. We caught up with a molecular biologist, Douglas Axe, in Seattle.
In our lab work, we've asked how rare or how common functional proteins are within the space of possibilities. Doing experiments and calculations, we found that they're exceedingly rare, like 1 in 10 to the 74th power rare. To get a feel for those odds, imagine that somebody hid one atom somewhere within the Milky Way galaxy, and you, blindfolded by chance, are supposed to pick one atom and hope that it's the right one. Those odds would be better than the odds for the protein.
Axe calculated the probability for all the chance mutations in all of the life forms on Earth for billions of years. And in all that time, he found they couldn't chance on even one new functional protein structure. Not one. 0. And keep in mind, it takes thousands of distinct proteins to build any kind of complex life, including humans. And many of these proteins are unique to each individual life form. So we go from improbable to basically impossible.
The bottom line is that the mutation selection mechanism simply lacks the creative power to generate the new information necessary to build new organisms in the history of life.
If the material processes of mutation and natural selection aren't capable of producing the biological information needed for life, then where did it come from?
Our uniform and repeated experience, as Darwin himself pointed out, is the basis of all scientific reasoning about the past. So when we see information in a digital form in software or we see a paragraph in a book, and we trace that information back to its source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. That's part of what we know from our observation of the world around us, that information always arises from an intelligent source. So we can apply that knowledge to the question of historical biology. And when we see that information is the foundation of life, we can infer that the best explanation for the origin of that information is in fact also a mind, a conscious agent, not an undirected material process.
When presented with evidence that conflicts with neo-Darwinism, most scientists cling to a belief in the blind process of evolution, denying what science has discovered. That at the foundation of life, there exists a code so complex and advanced that it defies chance. They make no room for the possibility that we were created by an intelligence far more sophisticated than the most genius of programmers. Instead, they choose to limit their investigation to a strictly materialist worldview. When faced with this evidence, how will you respond? We are not materialists. We see the human soul. We experience love. We live with purpose. We fight for justice. We acquire joy, and we require no longer.
Okay, so according to Dr. Stephen Meyer, the natural selection mutation process just does not have the power to generate something as complicated as DNA. We saw the odds there from Dr. Douglas Axe. So on your handout, information always arises from an intelligent source. That's what Dr. Meyer said as well. And a couple more points there about DNA. Human DNA in a single cell contains more organized information than the Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, I haven't used an encyclopedia in a long, long time, but I remember that there's volumes and volumes and volumes of books. You could go there and get anything, any kind of information that you wanted about all kinds of things. It's organized. That's what DNA has more complexity than the Encyclopedia Britannica in one cell. The odds, and Douglas Axe pointed this out, the odds of one DNA protein molecule forming by chance from amino acids is 1 times in 10 to the 125th power, 10 with 125 zeros after it. Just wanted to mention too, I forgot to mention this at the start, but if you're not a huge fan of all the science, we're going to hit a lot of science tonight. The next 4 weeks, we're going to hit more evidence from history, philosophy, definitely scripture, some archaeology. But tonight, you're going to get a big dose of science again. Second point on the slide there, the prebiotic soup. This is what evolutionary scientists tell us is the name for the early Earth's environment. The chemicals that made up the sea, the soil, the atmosphere, they called it the prebiotic soup. It turns out that the Earth didn't contain much organic matter for life in that prebiotic soup. There was an experiment that was done in 1953 by Stanley Miller and Dr. Urey. And many of you may have seen this in your high school science classes, where they put together water, ammonia, hydrogen, and methane in a jar. That's what they thought the early Earth's environment was like, in the seas, in the atmosphere, so on and so forth. They then hit it with sparks to simulate lightning, and they actually produced some brown sludge, which had some very rudimentary amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, which could then, arguably go to DNA. The problem is that since then, scientists have discovered that the early Earth's environment had none of these water, ammonia, hydrogen, methane that they used in the experiment. Had almost no organic matter whatsoever. Nitrogen levels were very low. So scientists on both creationist and evolution side have kind of abandoned this idea that the Miller-Urey experiment actually showed that you could get life from non-life, which is what evolutionists thought when the experiment came out in the 1950s. They celebrated, but it's kind of been disproved since then. Last point, There is no direct empirical evidence for abiogenesis. They've tried to make it happen in laboratories. And every time they've had to use intelligence to conduct the experiment, to change the parameters. And even in that, they get very minimal chemical combinations that lead toward amino acids and proteins. In fact, Stanley Miller himself, when he got his brown sludge, he removed chemicals that were detrimental to amino acids. So a lot of this information, I just wanted to draw your attention to the resources section on your worksheet. A lot of this and other information we're going to go over tonight is in this book by Lee Strobel called The Case for a Creator. I'd highly recommend it. Really easy to read. But just to give a shout out to our resources section. So back to the question. Can random, undirected processes, natural selection, mutation that we know about from Darwinian evolution, can they bring life into existence from non-living matter? The evidence is there. I'm going to turn it over to Clint to talk about macro-microevolution.
Well, I don't have the evidence, so don't ask me. Let's springboard off of what Sean asked in his video. Is evolution true? I would answer yes and no. What was alluded to earlier, that evolution, simple definition, change over time, it's a misunderstood term for sure. It's actually, I think, can be scary, but I think that it's actually pretty common throughout life. Whether we're talking about biology tonight, but it's commonplace idea in business, in sociology. So I think we get familiar with the term, we get familiar with the different ways of looking at it, we can become comfortable with it. So we're going to look at microevolution and macroevolution. Let's start with microevolution. It's an evolutional change within a species. So it's something due to a gene variant, something in the genes, allele frequencies, if you want to get real technical. And these things happen over time and are preserved over time for the benefit of the species. We actually have evidence of something like microevolution, or it could be microevolution right under our nose, literally. I mean, talking about our wisdom teeth. The recent information that I've read is that more and more babies are being born without wisdom teeth or with fewer wisdom teeth. And, probably take a survey here, and most people have had their wisdom teeth removed if you're over a certain age, or they were impacted and dental procedure required. Something happened in the human population over the years, change in diet, and it's a genetic change. And it's actually pretty fascinating and pretty amazing that happens, and we can see it happening. We don't know what phase we're in of that change, maybe the very beginning. It's fascinating, but it is, on a deeper level, it's very complicated. It's complex at the cellular and genetic level. And in large organisms, especially us as humans, these changes take a lot of time. And what's interesting when I read what we read about Charles Darwin when he proposed his theory of evolution, he didn't know about these complex changes in the genetic code. But another thing that we know about it is nothing's happening in the basic DNA structure. So this is microevolution. We have substantial evidence that proves that microevolution is a fact. And I want you to see a video here. We're going to see another example of what takes place in microevolution.
The peppered moth is a species of moth found in England. There are two variations of color in the species. Some moths are white with dark speckles, and some moths are dark with light speckles. The peppered moths live in environments with light-colored trees, like birch trees. Which moth do you think has an advantage in this environment? Can you find the moths? There's one more, do you see it? The light-colored moths had an advantage for survival. Their color helped them to blend into their environment and hide from hungry predators like birds. The dark-colored trait was a disadvantage. Moths with this trait were more easily spotted by predators and had a lower chance of survival. Since the light-colored trait had an advantage for survival, it was more commonly seen in the population. This was due to natural selection. Individuals who are best suited for an environment survive longer, reproduce more times, and pass on their genes. Natural selection over many generations can cause noticeable evolutionary changes in a species, and the peppered moth is the perfect example. In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution took place. Manual labor was taken over by machinery. Factories began to produce goods. These factories were powered by coal. The burning of coal released a lot of pollution. Dark clouds of soot and ash lingered in the air and even settled on the trees. Over time, the once light-colored trees were covered in a layer of dark soot. Which color variation had the advantage after industrialization changed the environment? The dark-colored moths now had the advantage. They were able to blend well into the soiled trees, while the light-colored variation stood out. Light-colored moths were more easily spotted by predators and had a lower chance of survival. They reproduced less often, and the frequency of this trait decreased over time. The dark-colored moths increased in frequency after many successful generations of survival and reproduction. But this story has one more plot twist. It didn't take long for people to realize that air pollution was a major problem. Laws were put into place and factories began to reduce their emissions. The skies were once again clear, and the trees as well returned to their natural light color. As a result, over time, the dark moths decreased in frequency, and the light moths became the more common variation once again. This is evolution by natural selection.
Okay, but one thing to point out here is the moth is still a moth. Bottom line with microevolution is that, everybody across the board pretty much accepts it as fact. Macroevolution, let's look at that for a minute. It's evolutional change resulting in the formation of new groups at higher taxonomic levels. So we alluded to some of these earlier, dinosaurs to birds, primates evolving to Homo sapiens. The Darwinian principle, kind of think of it as three legs of a stool. Scott mentioned a couple of these. Undirected biological or chemical changes, that's one leg of the Darwinian stool. Lots of time, and then a common ancestry. So that's what you have. Those are the main ingredients of Darwinian evolution. Let's take a look at an example from the animal kingdom, the Canis lupus familiaris. You may be familiar with this particular animal, the regular domestic dog, Fluffy. Fluffy is, an affectionate term for a house pet. And at some point in our past, humans decided we wanted to take dogs, breed them, domesticate them for a purpose, whether it was in our farming operation or breeding for hunting. And so over time, you take a wolf and it becomes a dog, and we have all these breeds today that are basically closely related to the wolf. So nothing too crazy there. If you wanted to go down the Darwinian route, the theory is that about 60 million years ago, there was a little weasel-like creature crawling around, and since then, we've had numerous changes in that organism to get to a wolf. So, is this true? I'm not so sure. Actually, little or no experimental evidence exists to establish this truth. You know, we would expect to see gradual transformations, and we would expect to see more of these transitional forms in the fossil record. Let me give you a couple of quotes to kind of put this into perspective. One of them is from Darwin himself, and he said, by this theory, evolution, innumerable transitional forms must have existed. Why do we not find them embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth? So it was a dilemma for Darwin, and it's a dilemma still today. A more recent observation of this was from the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, who he came onto the scene in the 70s, and it was he was on Time Magazine and National Geographic all through the 80s and 90s. He said, all paleontologists know that the fossil record contains precious little in the way of intermediate forms. Transitions between major groups are characteristically abrupt. He created the theory within evolution called punctuated equilibrium. Beyond this, there are other significant obstacles to macroevolution: the fossil record, genetic limits, which we alluded to. It's very, very challenging. Irreducible complexity, we talked about that last week. And this idea of the transitional forms and their viability. How do they survive when they're in the middle of this transition? So we are, our defense is that observed evidence actually points in the direction of design. Many of the features that are, present in the fossil record that are interpreted from an evolutionary perspective have ready interpretation from a design perspective. Here's another way to look at it. Let's check out this video.
Yes, sir. What's your name?
Carson Filament.
Carson. Go ahead, sir.
I was wondering if the hopeful monster theory fits into the Bible at all.
The hopeful monster. Describe what you mean by the hopeful monster.
The evolutionary theory where animals can birth an entirely new creature.
So macroevolution from the goo to you via the zoo? Is that what you mean? Can it fit into the Bible? Well, some Christians say it could, because they take Genesis 3 as allegorical or metaphorical. They don't say that God literally created Adam and Eve out of the dust. I actually think that's what it means, that God literally did create Adam and Eve out of the dust. I don't think macroevolution is true, not because the Bible doesn't say anything about it. I think it's not true because there's so much evidence against it. In fact, I'll just list 5 lines of evidence against it. We don't have time to go into the details, but the fossil record does not line up with what macroevolutionists say. There's not a whole bunch of transitional forms. There's genetic limits to change that we can't even break with all of our intelligence. Think about breeders that try and breed different types of dogs. They can only get so far in the genus of dogs, but even using all their intelligence, they can't make a cat or something outside of a dog. Well, if using our intelligence, we can't break genetic limits, why would we expect a non-intelligent process like natural selection to do so? Thirdly, there's something called irreducible complexity, that things can't evolve gradually in a step-by-step process. Everything has to be in working order with all the parts in the right order in order to have function at all. Fourthly, there's this thing out there known as epigenetic information, which is the structure of the cell. You could mutate DNA from now till doomsday, you'll never get a new body plan because you need structural changes. Just like if you were to have a software program, say it's a home design program, that could spit out a plan on how to build a home, but do you have a home with just a software program? No, you need structural materials like nails and wood and cement and those kind of things. So you need those things in order to have any new life form. That's four. I can't remember the five right now, but there's a lot of evidence against the macroevolutionary worldview that I just don't think it holds up.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you. Good question. Now, by the way, for those of you that are worried, come on up. Let me just make one more comment. Macroevolution could be 100% true. I don't think it is, but even if it were true, that you don't get rid of the need for God. Even if macroevolution is true, the underlying forces, the natural forces that allow it to occur are created and sustained by God. And the universe had a beginning, life had a beginning. That requires intelligence. Morality requires a moral standard, which is God's nature. Jesus still rose from the dead. So even if you want to say evolution is true, it doesn't mean Christianity's false. It may give us problems with biblical inerrancy in the Old Testament, but it does not mean Christianity's false.
All right, makes a lot of sense. A couple of other thoughts on this subject. So where does this leave Darwinian evolution? Evolutionists must have a faith that simple life forms evolved over geological ages into more complex life forms via an extraordinary rare mechanism of random beneficial mutations. And these dissimilar life forms evolved from a common ancestor by the same mechanism. Let me give you another quote here. This is from evolutionary zoologist Pierre-Paul Grasset. He observed, "Chance becomes a sort of providence, which, under the cover of atheism, is not named, but which is secretly worshipped." So why do so many scientists still hold on to Darwinism? And I think here's a couple of reasons. It explains our existence from a natural view, which has no need for God. And I think also it's because it remains the dominant theory out there. A intelligent design theory is just not acceptable to Darwinian scientists. So is science evil? No. We should actually celebrate scientific inquiry. Some of the greatest scientific breakthroughs have been made by Christians who believe the fear of God is the beginning of understanding, and also who believe, as Paul wrote in Romans, that God's eternal power and divine nature have been understood from what have been made. So I'll ask the question, is evolution true? I guess that depends.
All right, so let's dive just a little bit deeper. It's been mentioned already, the fossil record. If the Darwinian tree of life is true, and we have these different levels of complexity of organisms, then we would expect to find in the fossil record, in the dirt below us, these forms of a part fish, part amphibian, between fishes and amphibians. We'd expect to find part reptile and part bird in the fossil record. Do we have any of that? Darwin didn't have it when he wrote on the origin of the species. However, he assumed that those would be discovered later. So the question becomes, were those transitional forms discovered in the fossil record? What we find actually, what archaeology has told us, is that instead of developing slowly, major groups of animals appear suddenly in the fossil record. That's your handout. And about 530 million years ago, if you believe the dates, we had something called the Cambrian explosion, in which almost all of the major groups of modern animals appear. Now, Darwinian evolutionists claim that single cell life began to emerge about 3.7 billion years ago. So what happened between that single cell life at 3.7 billion and the Cambrian explosion at 530 million? Lee Strobel gives a great illustration of that in this book, of like a football field, where if you're at one goal line and that's the single-celled organism, and you start running down the field toward the other goal line, you cross the 30, the 40, the 50, the other 40, the other 30, you get to the 16-yard line near the other end zone. That's where the Cambrian explosion happens. That's where all the animals show up suddenly in the fossil record. So what happened for all that time you were running those 83 yards or whatever? Nothing, according to the fossil record. So question becomes, will we see anything else show up in the fossil record, or is it fairly complete? Do we kind of have a picture of what life has looked like? Let's watch this video, and they'll dive into that a little bit.
Dr. Meyer, we're glad that you're here. And today I want to begin with a clip from Illustra Media's beautiful documentary movie, Darwin's Dilemma, which gives a quick summary of what scientists have found in the fossil record over the last 150 years. I want you to listen.
During the past 150 years, fossil hunters have searched the Earth for the many transitional links Darwin's theory requires.
If I sent you on a treasure hunt and said, what I really want is this, you're going to go out and look for this, whatever it happens to be. Well, if you come at the fossil record with a Darwinian expectation of an abundance of transitionals, that's what's going to get you a professorship. You find those transitional forms. So all over the world, in countless outcrops, people have been looking for those forms that would capture the major transitions in the history of life.
This search has extended from the walls of the Grand Canyon to the shores of the Irish Sea. And as countless specimens have been excavated, one question endures. How complete is the Cambrian fossil record?
I think the Cambrian fossil record is surprisingly complete. I think it may be more complete than we realize. The reason for that is, for instance, if you look at the stratigraphy of the world, if I go and collect Cambrian rocks in Wales and find certain fossils, if I then go to China, I don't find the same species, but I find the same sorts of fossils. If I go into Carboniferous rocks, I go to Canada, they're the same as what I find in this country. So there is a clear set of faunas and floras which take us through geological time. The overall framework is falling into position.
There's no question that if you dig and sample more, you're going to find new kinds of fossils. But generally speaking, the fossils that we find fall into groups that we already knew about. When you see that, what I think nature is telling you is you've got a pretty good sample of the history of life on Earth. The groups that you already had established are the ones that capture the new fossils.
Now, Stephen, throughout this series, we've been talking about the mystery of the Precambrian ancestral fossils. And I want you to start by putting the little clip that we saw in context. What is the Cambrian explosion exactly? And then you say, besides the fossils, there's another problem as well. I want you to explain that.
Right. Well, we have been talking about the Cambrian explosion and a doubt that Darwin had about his own theory, not whether the theory was true. He was convinced it was, but he was concerned that his theory couldn't explain all the evidence, including a key piece of evidence about the origin of animal life on Earth, and that is what the Cambrian explosion is all about. It's the sudden appearance or the abrupt appearance in the fossil record of most of the major groups of animals that have ever existed on Earth. If the fossil record is incomplete, significantly incomplete, then we could say, well, you know, those missing ancestral fossils in the Precambrian rocks that we expect to be there given Darwin's theory maybe just haven't been found yet. That was something that Darwin thought was a possibility to explain this abrupt appearance of fossils in the Cambrian period. He thought, well, maybe the missing ones in the lower Precambrian layers are only missing from our point of view, that we just haven't found them yet. We haven't looked hard enough. But 155 some odd years later, that's not a very plausible explanation, especially as several of the scientists were saying in the previous clip, especially since the pattern of fossilization that we find just keeps getting reinforced by new fossils. And the new fossil finds have also made our awareness of just how explosive the Cambrian
event was, what we've learned is the Cambrian event is even more explosive than Darwin realized, because there are many new forms of life that have emerged, but they too are lacking discernible ancestors in the lower Precambrian strata. So the fossil evidence has created a big mystery. I call that in my book, The Mystery of the Missing Fossils. But as you allude to, there's also a second and deeper mystery, and that is the mystery of how the evolutionary process could have built these animals. It's an engineering problem. As we've learned more about what it takes to build an animal, what's inside cells, and how animals develop, that mystery has become much more acute. We've learned, for example, in the second half of the 20th century, that digital information stored in DNA is critical to building the proteins that keep cells and animals alive. So when you get a big explosion of new animal form in the fossil record, you're really looking at evidence of a big explosion of information, of digital code, literally. And so that raises a big question: where does that come from? On top of that, when we're looking at an animal, we're looking at something like a body architecture, what scientists call a body plan, which is a unique arrangement of body parts and tissues. So DNA is really necessary to build the small components called proteins that are inside cells that keep cells and animals alive. But we've now learned that there are additional levels of assembly instructions necessary to organize cells into tissues, and tissues into organs, and the organs and tissues into these larger body architectures. And that has raised a second and even more profound question about where these body plans come from and how they would have been built by the evolutionary process.
Okay, so according to the video and the scientists there, it seems like we have a pretty complete record of the types of animal groups that have been found in the fossil record, and the new ones that are found continue to fall into those groups. So why do evolutionary scientists still tell us that there are transitional forms? I mean, they're taught in our universities, they're taught in our schools. Why do they still say that? Let's take a look at some of the ones that are kind of the more famous ones, and some of these you'll be very familiar with. That first bullet point is just kind of all of the different major layers in the Darwinian tree of life. The invertebrates to vertebrates, fishes to amphibians, so on and so forth. Down at the bottom of that list, you see reptiles to birds. Quite a few years ago, they found an organism called the Archaeopteryx, which was supposedly a transitional form between a reptile and a bird. It had bird wings, it had feathers, but it has a lizard-like tail and claws. So they thought this is a transitional form between a reptile and a bird. Since that time, scientists pretty much across the board have decided this is an extinct bird. And this is kind of what happens. This is kind of the script that it goes through. It's claimed as a transitional form. More science is thrown at it, and it was really either a bird or a reptile. What is probably more familiar to all of us is this whole idea of apes to men. And what are the transitional forms of apes to men? And I know my list here is a little different from your handout, but let's look at a few of these and see what was found and what was concluded, and then decide from the evidence what we think. Ardipithecus ramidus, or Ardi, found in Ethiopia in 1992, had characteristics of a chimpanzee, but according to evolutionary paleontologists, Ardi walked upright. What was found? 110 bone pieces over a 30-foot area, and it took a decade to reconstruct Ardi, most of it digitally, because the find of the bones was in such poor shape. The bones crumbled to dust when they were touched. One of the archaeologists called it roadkill. So for me personally, not a lot of confidence there. But Ardi was the size of a chimpanzee. Ardi had the brain size of a chimpanzee, and there were no neck vertebrae found. Now that's significant because apes walk like a knuckle walk. You've seen that. And so their spine enters the cranium at an angle, whereas we humans, our spine enters the cranium straight up. So they don't really know whether Ardi walked upright or not. They kind of conclude that from pelvic bones and things like that. So the question goes to you: transitional form, chimpanzee, human being. I'm leaning toward chimpanzee myself based on the evidence that's there. Let's look at Lucy. Probably one that you've all heard about, Lucy, right? So Lucy was found in Ethiopia in 1974. Again, evolutionary scientists claiming that Lucy was a transitional form because she had monkey-like features, but she walked upright. What was found? Hundreds of small bone pieces over a 160-foot area that were glued together to make 47 skeletal parts. So about 20% of her skeleton was found. And you can see on the slide here, this is the bones that were found for Lucy that were glued back together from those hundreds of pieces. On the right, you see a reconstruction of Lucy. The white parts are plaster. The brown parts are the actual bones that were found. Look at the skull. Looks like a lot of imagination went into that skull to me based on what was found. Lucy was 3.5 feet tall, weighed 55 pounds, about the size of a chimpanzee, and the skull entered, or the spine entered the skull at an angle. So what did we just learn about that? Knuckle walk, right? Inner ear was like that of apes today. So question goes again, transitional form, chimpanzee, human being. I'll let you decide. The ones that they say are human, but were a distinct species of human, not humans like us, the Homo erectus, the Heidelberg man, the Neanderthal. These had, the reason they say these were different species of human is because they had different sizes, dimensions to some of their body parts, their craniums, their hips, pelvises, things like that. But they all had tools, they all did artwork, they all had community, they all walked upright. So they were some kind of human being, but were they that different from us? I mean, we can go around the world and see people with different dimensions to different body parts. So whether these were different kinds of human beings, I don't know. The evidence just is not terribly convincing for me. Now, if with all of the hype around evolutionary transitional forms that we hear from evolutionary scientists, you would think that there were just tons and tons of these skeletons found all over the earth. And that it's just overwhelming evidence that we had apes that evolved into men. Well, what I found is a quote from a gentleman by the name of Ian Tattersall. He is the curator emeritus of the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Very prestigious museum. This guy's the top curator. And he was asked, what about the size of the total archive of early human bones? And this is what he said. The whole of our understanding of human prehistory is based on the remains, often exceedingly fragmentary, small things, small bones, of perhaps 5,000 individuals out of the billions of people that have lived on this earth. You could fit all of it into the back of a pickup truck if you didn't mind how much you jumbled everything up. So all of the bones they found to tell us that we came from apes, you could put in the back of a Ford F-150. Doesn't impress me. I don't know. Maybe it impresses you. Doesn't impress me. I'm going to turn it over to Brent to talk about creationist approaches.
Thanks, Scott. All right, so tonight I'm going to talk with you a little bit about, like we said, creationist approaches, creation-based approaches. So probably the best place to start would be at the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But the earth was void and without form, and darkness was over the face of the deep. But the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. This, of course, is the familiar beginning of the Genesis account of creation, how God created the world and everything in it. And I'd like you to notice something by way of sentence structure. What the very first subject of the very first sentence of the very first book of the Bible was. In the beginning, God. God is the subject. And that's not mere literary convention. God is the subject of and is preeminent in all his creation. So this Genesis account, it was reflective of the Hebrew worldview at the time that it was written, approximately 1500 BC or so. And this worldview was a competitive worldview, meaning it was competing against other worldviews at the time. We had the Greek worldview that said that the earth was the playground of the gods and that men were the gods' playthings. And then there was the Babylonian view of creation, which said that the council of the gods brought order out of the chaos of the primordial earth, and then two minor gods got to duke it out to see who got to fill the earth with the rest of creation. This Genesis account is a carefully constructed presentation to inform the Jewish mind of certain things about their God. Notice that the Hebrew God was one compared to the Greeks and the Babylonians who had multiple gods. Also, certain things about God's nature. He was transcendent in nature in that he was above his creation. But also, relationships were important to God. His creation was ordered, it was structured, boundaries were set up. When he pronounced something good, he also indirectly set up a standard for morality. And when it came to men and women, to humans, we were made in God's image. Now, exactly what it means to be made in God's image, there's a lot of discussion about. Genesis doesn't tell us exactly what that means. But maybe one of the things it could mean is that we humans, being made in God's image, have an elevated intellect and a will. Sometimes that intellect gets curious, and that will, famously for us humans, drives us on to want to know stuff. And when we look at the natural world around us, in all of its wonder and beauty and complexity, our curious intellects and our tenacious wills demand answers. We want to know. Unfortunately, one of the things that Genesis 1 does not attempt to tell us is the scientific detail behind the processes that God used to create the world and everything in it. So tonight we're talking about theistic evolution and intelligent design. Those are two viewpoints. They're viewpoints by which we can understand and explain God's creation in more detail, but still within the bounds and consistent with Scripture. So before we start, I want to have an editorial comment here. In case you don't know, this is a hot topic. There are people with strong opinions who reside in both of these viewpoints. People who are also committed followers of Jesus and serious scientists that reside in both of these viewpoints. So I want to ask you to please resist the temptation to belittle one viewpoint versus another because it doesn't happen to be your viewpoint. Instead, with charity, we will learn together this evening and grow and be armed with knowledge. So let's start with theistic evolution. Here's a definition of theistic evolution. The belief that God created all living things through Christ, including human beings in his image, making use of intentionally designed, actively sustained natural processes that scientists today study as evolution. All right, well, let's look at some of the tenets of theistic. Well, first, before we look at the tenets, I do want to tell you something. Theistic evolutionists, somebody that belongs to that camp, most theistic evolutionists hate their name. They don't like that name. And here's why. They think that it emphasizes the evolution piece and relegates God, the theistic part, to a mere adjective. They prefer a name that would make God and his creative power the subject, and they'll describe it with evolution. So since the mid-1990s, most theistic evolutionists prefer the name evolutionary creationist. For the rest of tonight, I'll refer to that viewpoint as evolutionary creation. So the tenets of evolutionary creation. The first one is evolution is a scientific theory, not a worldview. There's a nuance here, and I'll see if I can explain it. This is an evolutionary creationist's attempt to distinguish himself from other groups that hold to evolution. Many atheists today think that evolutionary theory negates the need for God in understanding the natural world. And because of that, they hold up evolution, and in particular, they'll call it Darwinian or neo-Darwinian evolution, as proof that they can look at the world the way they want to see it, their worldview, which is no God, no accountability, and as famous atheist Richard Dawkins said, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. An evolutionary creationist does not agree. An evolutionary creationist's worldview is that God is the creator and sustainer of life. And they view evolution as the best scientific explanation of that process. That would be like me saying, I believe that God will provide for the development and growth of plants, and I view photosynthesis as the best scientific explanation of that process. Now here I do want to interject one curious thing about evolutionary creation. They don't give a scientific explanation for the origin of life. While they believe that God is the creator and sustainer of life, they make sure that you know that their science has to do with the development and diversification of life forms after first life. That's where they leave it, and so that's where I'll leave it and move on to the next tenet. The next tenet of evolutionary creation says evolution rests on common descent. We've heard this earlier this evening. For the evolutionary creationist, the theory of evolution states all life forms on Earth share a common ancestor as a result of variation and selection over a very long time. That time frame's about 4 billion years. Now, if you were paying close attention, you would have heard two words in there that were different, intentionally different, than words you might have heard from a more traditional explanation of what evolution is. Those words are variation and selection. A neo-Darwinian evolutionist would not use those two words. He would use random mutation and natural selection. And he'd choose those terms because they emphasize the random, undirected process as they view it. An evolutionary creationist here would object. They would say variation and selection are anything but random, but rather they are intentionally designed, actively sustained processes that God uses in his omnipotence and his foreknowledge to bring about the types of species that we see on Earth, that we've seen in the past, and that we see even today living on Earth. Final tenet of evolutionary creation is that humans are unique among all life forms and that they are made in the image of God. This is evolutionary creation's explanation for human exceptionalism. What makes us different than the other life forms on Earth? Now, we've already said that what it means to be made in God's image, there's a lot of discussion about what that means, a lot of good answers. I was reading one evolutionary creationist who had a particularly beautiful answer for what he thinks it means to be made in God's image, and I thought I would share it with you. He says that humans, Homo sapiens, are the idealizing species, meaning that we have the ability to not only see things the way they are, but the way they should be. And that's just like God, made in his image. So those are the definitions and tenets of evolutionary creation. We'll move over here to intelligent design. Here's a definition of intelligent design. Certain features of the universe and of living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process, such as natural selection. All right, so on your handout here, the first two bullets that we'll talk about under intelligent design, you've hopefully recognized those. You've seen them before. We talked about them last week as reasons to believe that that God exists, and this week we'll talk about them as reasons that give evidence for intelligent design. The first one, the cosmological argument, the idea that the universe had a cause outside of itself. The intelligent design proponent would tell you that intelligent cause is God. The anthropic principle, the next one, is another way of saying the teleological argument. And if you remember from last week, that was the idea that the universe is exquisitely finely tuned, and the earth in particular is tailor-made to support life. So is that a cosmic coincidence? No, the intelligent design person would say absolutely not, but rather the super intelligence required to, if you'll remember last week, monkey with the physics to make it all perfect had to come from an intelligent cause, that cause, of course, being God. Which brings us to DNA. This is the jewel in the crown of intelligent design. Intelligent design finds great proponent in DNA and the things that we've recently learned about DNA. Now, you may have heard metaphors that kind of help us understand DNA, such as the building blocks of life or the blueprints of life. Well, those metaphors are kind of passé now, that they don't do the best job of explaining what DNA is. We now know that DNA can best be explained as being information. To give you a quick overview, that information in the nucleus of your cells is used to inform the cellular processes of what types of different proteins they should produce, and those proteins become structure to help a cell specialize in the type of cell that it becomes, whether it's a muscle cell or a nerve cell or a blood cell. Okay, that process is extremely interesting. But for our purposes tonight, it's the fact that DNA is information that makes it so important, and in fact, one of the most important arguments for intelligent design. Let's watch a quick video about that.
As a scientist,
microbiologist, biochemist, as a geologist,
neuroscientist,
physician,
Biologist and an engineer.
I think there is overwhelming evidence for intelligent design in nature.
I see intelligent design in the history of life,
in the genetic code of life,
in the molecular machines inside our cells,
in the complexity of life,
in the information embedded in living things,
in the operation of the human brain,
in the features of the human body,
in the chicken and egg causal circularity of life.
As a mathematician, I see great evidence of purpose in the universe.
As a molecular biologist, I see evidence for design everywhere I look, pretty much.
Nature is incomprehensible without inference to purpose and to intelligent design.
The properties of the universe as a whole, and our planet in particular, were fine-tuned for our benefit and for our survival.
In my view, the fossil evidence clearly points towards intelligent design.
I see life as designed because when I look at life at the molecular level, I see exquisite engineering.
All cells contain DNA, which include lots of information. And information is only the product of a mind.
Darwin thought living cells were just blobs of jelly, but when I look in a living cell, I see evidence of factories, machines, three-dimensional architectures, enormous amounts of encoded information.
There's power generators, there's manufacturing plants.
Life contains many features that we know from experience only arise from the activity of intelligent agents.
The genetic code is like a software program. It's like somebody would have had to be a coder, would have had to form this particular genetic code. When I see that order and design, I have a really hard time believing that random mutation and natural selection alone can cause the complexity and the diversity we see in life.
When you look at nature at large, what you see is incredible examples of innovation which surpass human technology. Examples include the flight capabilities of a hummingbird, sonar, and bats, and greater innovation always implies greater intelligence from a designer.
If you read the message from the molecules, it's really clear. They say clearly, intelligent design, intelligent design, intelligent design is the source of life.
All right, that's pretty compelling stuff. About the turn of the century, a man named Francis Collins became the first human to map the human genome. Now, if you don't know what a genome is the complete list of genetic instructions of any organism. So what Mr. Collins did is he basically was able to, from observation, write down the complete list of genetic instructions for this organism, for the human. And one of the things that came out of his mapping the human genome, interestingly, is that he found that the human genome is remarkably similar to the genome of lower life forms, much more similar than we originally thought. Well, the Darwinian evolutionists jumped up from their chair and shouted, "Eureka, there it is, that's our proof. We have genetic similarity, which must prove that we come from a common ancestor." But intelligent design pushed back. They said that we reject the idea of common ancestry in favor of the idea, do we have that slide up? Yes, in favor of the idea of common design. And here's how that works. The intelligent design proponent will ask the question, wait a minute, how come genetic similarity automatically means that we must have a common ancestor? Why doesn't genetic similarity show rather that we have a common designer? If I have two Picassos up in front of me and I notice the similarities between Picassos, I don't think that they're cousin paintings. I think that they've been created by the same artist. So this works in art, but do we have any evidence that it also works in biology? Well, we could go back to the beginning. In Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, we get a little more information, just a little more, not a lot more, a little more information about how God created humans and the rest of the animal kingdom. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says, "The Lord God formed the man out of the dust of the earth." Formed. That word formed is from the Hebrew word yasar, which means to make or to fashion. We see that word again about 12 verses later in verse 19, where it says, "And then the Lord formed the beasts of the field and the birds of the air out of, again, the dust of the earth." So what is this saying? Well, I think that in this case, Scripture may be hinting to the fact that both men and beasts, the rest of the animal kingdom, were formed or fashioned in the same manner out of the dust of the earth, the same substance, maybe even the same genetic material. I think that Scripture might be hinting to us that we should expect to see genetic similarities among all life forms, humans and lower life forms. Okay, from a scientific standpoint, what evidence do we have that our DNA might be telling us that we have a common designer? We'll go back to the information piece, the idea about information. When we look at the DNA and we look at the amazing amount of information, specific and unique information that we find in DNA, and especially when we look at the origin of life, some really interesting things ought to come to our heads. We ought to think about. There is a famous, he's called an informational scientist. I guess they have these things. But he was quoted as saying, all new information created is habitually associated with conscious activity. All new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. So at the origin of life, when we had no life, there was nothing, there was nothingness. And then instantly, we have life. We have some type of organism. We don't know exactly what the first one was, but some type of organism. It must have had, because this is what we've seen and what we've learned in all science, cells and DNA with information that produced proteins that became other types of cells that grew. We had life. No amount of random mutation could produce life from nothing. Everything in our natural experience shows us that information requires an intelligent source. If you're walking down the beach and you see inscribed in the sand a heart with the words, "Johnny loves Susie," you don't probably look at that and go, "Wow, amazing what wind and erosion can randomly produce on the beach." No. You look at that and you know that Johnny and Susie had been there, and they left us information to interpret. The bottom line is, a great computer program requires a programmer. A beautiful poem requires a poet. And the incredible amount of majestic information that we see packed into the DNA of all living things requires an intelligent source, a super intelligent source. And it just so happens that about 4.5 billion years ago, that intelligent source said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
Wow. Good evening. I'm not the showman that Brent is, but, and I know a lot of you are kind of reeling from the amount of information that we've just received. I grew up in the 70s, 80s. That's when I went to school, in 80s into the 90s, actually. And a lot of this stuff that we talked about or debunked today was professed then. But I think, as we saw tonight, in the time between now and then, the God of the gaps, as some scientists would call it, has been filled with more information, not less. We saw how, Scott alluded to it earlier today, and Brent just finished up with it. We didn't see, if we look at single-celled organisms today, we see that there's almost the same amount of information in them that's present in our bodies, which means that the possibility of us evolving from those, something had to create that with that much information in it. So a lot of information tonight, but really I think the bottom line is it just encourages us in the fact that as we find out new things, we're finding there's more and more design. I mean, we didn't even talk about epigenetics tonight, and Scott alluded to it a little bit, but now there's an entire field of epigenetics which actually goes into, okay, well, how is that DNA unfolded every time a cell reproduces, and then how is it refolded, and how is the information taken from one piece, and we don't even understand the mechanism of how that happens now. So we're talking about an extra layer of information. I mean, we drank through a fire hose tonight. If we were to talk about epigenetics, we could talk probably for another half hour at least. So with that, I just want to open it up to questions. And something that kind of struck me this week is all this information is great, but the average person is probably not going to walk up to you and ask you to go into the kind of details we went into tonight. So something I learned kind of earlier in my walk is don't go slam people with this information if they don't ask for it. We do all this to prepare ourselves for an encounter where somebody might kind of stand up a small argument where they're like, oh, well, evolutionary theory can explain everything, and you might be able to spout out a few things. Well, I've heard this, and kind of put a chink in their armor and make them think about it. And oh, by the way, apologetics is an ongoing process. It's not like a one and done, okay, well, I just throw my argument back at you. It's a dialogue that goes back and forth. So with that, I just want to go ahead and open the floor to questions from both here within the auditorium and to folks online. So let's get it started.
Hold on real quick. I'm going to come over here so that our folks online can hear you.
So there's a website, it's called answersingenesis.org, and there's it's called the Young Earth Creationists, and they said they believe that the Earth was formed in the literal 6 24-hour days only 6 to 12,000 years ago. Did you guys ever look into that, or just interested? Probably one for the parking lot, most definitely, but.
Yeah, that's actually one of the references that Scott recommended to me to go to. And there's actually, I mean, so you can go to sources like that, and then you'll go to sources on the other side of the fence that will argue the exact opposite. I think something that was kind of interesting to me in listening through a lot of this stuff and listening to William Lane Craig is, and something we kind of saw tonight where we set up the idea of intelligent design and theistic evolution, I think we need to be willing to have these conversations both in-house and with folks on the outside where we're kind of delving into those topics. Personally, you know, I could tell you what I think about that, but I think it's more important that we're able to go to those resources and actually, you know, weigh them for ourselves or point other people to those resources and have them weigh them for themselves. Is there a question, or, I mean, other than, you know, are you acquainted with the resources and have you seen them?
I just wondered if you guys had looked into that and if there's much science to back that up.
There's a considerable amount of information on both sides. And as the science comes out, we have to leave the science to scientists, kind of like we appeal to authority, some of the folks on the screen tonight, but it's best to kind of leave the science to the scientists, because I think we tend to get too into conversations with other people about the science where maybe they're not going. We lead ourselves down a path where we're showing like we think we know all this information, but we get ourselves kind of in a dangerous point, which is, you know, to the point I alluded to earlier, answer the questions that are asked.
We'll provide that in the email, those resources. Clint actually talked with Pastor Mark about this today or yesterday, and Pastor Mark would hold to that view from an exegetical perspective from the text of Genesis 1:1. So that's what you will hear from Pastor Mark from the pulpit, is those 6 literal days. As Tony said, they're both sides from a scientific point of view, and we'll include those resources. So,
yeah.
More questions?
I mean, even within like the record, the fossil record that we're talking about, there's arguments on both sides of the fence about how quickly that fossil record actually came together and what kind of things happened on the planet. And actually, Answers in Genesis actually has a whole piece on how the dinosaurs, you know, got uplayed into the layers of sediment and things like that. So, but then you'll have people on the other side who can argue the point that, well, it happened over a longer period of time as well, and some of the data seems to support that. So, I think there was another question. Let's go back there.
Mine was pretty similar to that. I believe in, I don't know about like 6 literal days, but I do believe that, you know, we need to take Genesis literally. I was wondering what the timeline should be that I should believe of how long ago the Earth started. And I know there's so many different theories, but, you know, as a creationist, what is the timeline that I should be looking at, and how do they match up with the fossil records, and how would I be able to defend myself with someone that says scientifically we have these? How do they even date the fossils? Is it carbon dating? Okay, and how reliable is that?
Half-life of carbon. They'll get some organic material out of a rock, and then they'll measure the half-life of carbon against that as it deteriorates, and then they figure it out. So there's discrepancies where people say it's not reliable dating. I mean, you saw some incredible dates for, you know, the Cambrian period, 530 million years ago. Many creationists will dispute that. So in terms of your question of what your time period you should hold to when you're talking to these people, as Tony said, there's good science on both sides. So it's really, you're looking at the evidence and determining which of those. We'll provide the resources, though, for Young Earth, where you can look into that.
And you kind of bring up an interesting point, which is that you don't necessarily have to have all the answers for all of these questions. You can point people to resources that are actually on both sides and go, well, there's debate that goes on about that, and be willing to point them to the resources for both sides and say, well, that's a decision you need to come to. You can have your own decision based on the information that you've seen, but be open to the idea that, okay, well, if they come to you and say, well, I think this, it's like, okay, well, there might be some evidence to support that as well. We're not gaining this information so that we can like strike down somebody else's position. It's more providing them the information so that they can actually think through their own mind, okay, question what they believe and why they believe it, which is really one of the most important things I think you can do as an apologist, is make other people question their position based on information that you can provide them. Yeah.
Let's go one more.
Any more questions within the auditorium? Okay, and usually what we'll have to do with the questions online is we'll take those via the text and we'll answer them in the same way that we answered the questions this week. So did we want to go into the session on?
No, why don't you just wrap it up, summarize and pray for us, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of information tonight. I'm sure there's tons of questions out there, but I think the important part of having all this information is understanding that you only really need the information if somebody's going in this direction. Ultimately, salvation is a work of God, and Jesus said it was real simple how you're saved. Okay, it's you believe in your heart and you speak with your mouth that that He is Lord, and so we can get wrapped up in all these other things, and sometimes people don't even want to go down that route. They have other questions. So dialogue is so important. I'm talking a lot here about dialogue, and to me, that I found that's the most important thing, is a continuing dialogue. You're not going to have one conversation with somebody and then all of a sudden they're going to change their opinion that they've held over the course of years or built up over the course of years. So with that, I'll just go ahead and say a final prayer for us. Lord, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for our minds. Thank you that you created everything with an intricacy that we can't even begin to fathom. Our minds are saturated tonight with all the information we've been provided. And I mean, I think as we already alluded to, there's more layers of information on top of that that speak to just how intricately you created us and knit us together and the universe together, Lord. Thank you that you continue to provide that information to us, and that you're bringing so many scientists and hard thinkers to you through virtue of the fact that it's undeniable that there's so much design in our universe, and that's because of you. Lord, thank you that you love us enough to be patient with us in our doubt and in the questions that we have. Help us to be patient with others in the questions and the doubts that they have, Lord, by your Spirit. Lord, thank you most of all for the sacrifice you made to us through Jesus Christ that makes it possible for us to be together here tonight and as one body to work on ways to be able to reach out for you and serve for you, Lord. And we just thank you for this time together. In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week. We'll talk about the Bible next week.